Well, it was pretty tough. We were in the middle of a recession that went on to last for about 2 years. It was the longest period of downturn that had occurred in Australia since the Depression. It started around the time of you remember the pilot strike, and that seemed to spark some bad things. There was a lot of wet weather over those 2 years on the eastern coast, which delayed a lot of big property projects that were going on. And it was the aftermath too of massive liquefying of the economies in the Western world by the various central banks as a result of the stock market crash of 1987. And so banks' deposits were very, very high. They'd been growing rapidly. And as a consequence, it sparked a massive property boom, probably the biggest boom that they'd had in Australia for about 100 years. And in fact, when the crash eventually came, it was said to be the worst crash since the 1890s, when about 12 financial institutions actually closed their doors. So it was pretty grim. Unemployment went out to about 11%, and the bank was right in the middle of this swirl of problems, particularly with property.
Frank, at that time, Westpac had been on a growth trajectory. All of those in this room will understand the position of AGC, PPL, the Westpac letters, foreign exchange fraud, CS90, and the domestic... I don't think people were laughing at that stage. And domestic provisioning. Are there any of those you'd particularly like to highlight? If we look at, we've got the economic framework, we now look at how Westpac was positioned at this time.
Well, I remember the Westpac Letters affair, which actually Stuart Fowler was still chief executive then, and poor Stuart had to manage that. And I remember in his office after 3 o'clock each afternoon, every afternoon, day after day after day, you'd have this conference, and you'd have legal advisors, accounting advisors, tax advisors, and all sorts of people around the table, and trying to manage the huge fallout that was occurring as a result of some stolen letters that occurred in London by a group that subsequently were caught criminally for blackmail, and because they'd stolen these letters. With the help, I must say, of some of the diplomatic service from another country, which we won't name, but so it was a pretty heady time, the foreign letters. CS90, a lot of people would remember that. We were having problems with that because it was being delayed, all sorts of reasons for that, but basically it was starting to cost us a lot of money. It was delayed in time, so we weren't going to get it for a long time, and what we're being promised, we weren't. The scope of it wasn't going to be as big. The frauds in the foreign exchange area were probably one of the most challenging. I remember one where there was an internal auditor, what we now call a whistleblower, had been in the bank as an internal auditor, and he alleged that there'd been some skullduggery going on in the foreign exchange area. He went to Four Corners, and I remember having to go on the Four Corners program live with the late Andrew Olley, and they had a big package that went on for about 15 minutes or about 20 minutes of the story of what was going on in Westpac in the foreign exchange area. And then the camera light went red and we went on live. And I hadn't seen that package before. So it was pretty heady and pretty stressful at the time. But you know, we got over all those things. And I've mentioned to you, Carolyn, that it was like fighting a war with a battle every day. There was something different going on every day. And I often quote that in the Financial Review, I think they still do it to this day, they list all the companies that are mentioned in the paper, and then the page number of what page they're on. Well, Westpac used to have 2 lines of those every day. You know, I mean, it was just time and time again. And the media people, we had 2 full-time media people. I remember one day they had 80 calls came in for requests for information and for interviews and things like that. And every night before I went home, I got a page of things that are likely to be in the press tomorrow. And that went on every day. So it was like fighting a battle.
Frank, your exact words were, it was like being in a war with battles to be fought each day with the regulators, ratings agents, market analysts, media, dissatisfied customers, and continual litigation. It was May 1992, just 8 months after you were appointed managing director, when you had to announce a loss of $1.66 billion. That must have been extremely tough.
Well, it was, and as you say, it was our 175th year, and here it was being handed the stewardship of Westpac, the oldest company in Australia, and we were about to announce our first loss. It was pretty tough. We worked on it for a long time. We believed we were doing the right thing. It took a long time to bring the board around to make that decision, but we needed to because we were just getting really taken apart when we were presenting to the three rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Moody's and Fitch as it was then, that were rating us, and they kept on dropping our ratings down. The Reserve Bank was starting to be quite heavy because the supervisory control of the banks was in the hands of the Reserve Bank then, not APRA as it is now. And they were starting to get a little bit sort of tut, tut, tut. And it was pretty hard. And when we did announce it, it was the largest loss in corporate history. It's quite funny, if I may just for a second, I went to Cottesloe Primary School where another young fellow went to who became the Treasurer of Australia, a chap by the name of John Dawkins. And my sister sent over a little clipping out of a newspaper that said that, you know, we've got two great alumni out of Cottesloe Primary. One is John Dawkins, who's just announced the largest deficit in Australia's history, and the other is Frank Conroy, who's just announced the largest corporate debt. So we're a great alumni out of Cottesloe Primary School. But it was pretty hard, and the team around me worked enormously that time. We had a lot of work to do with the media, and it was hard work.
Frank, not long after that, Kerry Packer had built an option over 10% of Westpac shares. He gained 2 board positions and persuaded the board that there was a need for fresh blood at the top, and your resignation was sought. So for those of us in this room who look back with the greatest respect for you, could I ask you just tell us how that felt?
Well, what happened was that, for those who remember, there was quite a significant board change occurred just a little while before, and John Urig had become chairman. And I had to give him quite a significant briefing. He lived in Adelaide, so I went across to Adelaide and spent probably 3/4 of a day downloading everything that I knew about the bank and the problems we're facing and the things we've talked about this morning. And I remember right at the end of it saying to him, look, I want you to know that I firmly believe that if there's ever any time you feel that the directors were losing their confidence in what I was doing, just come and tell me and I'll go. And I said that to him again about 3 weeks later. I reminded him of the conversation, so that when it came for the decision to be made at the board, I was told many months later that they wanted me to resign. One of the directors, and I don't know who it was, said, how's young Frank going to take this? And John Urig was able to say as the chairman, I know exactly how he's going to take this because we've discussed it. So when after about 3 hours of board meeting with both Kerry Packer and Al Dunlap in the boardroom, not as directors because they weren't allowed. Al Dunlap got his up-and-comings later on. John Urig came out and said, well, they want you to resign. And so what did I feel? I felt fairly numb, I guess. I think the 3 hours leading up to it, I'd pretty well come to the conclusion that something was going to happen. My worst fear that it was going to be both the chairman and the chief executive were going to be asked to step down. As it turned out, it was just my role. And of course, we had things to do. We had to get the executives to get together and inform them. There was an annual report that had just been printed. That had to be reprinted because we had to take photos out of it and all this sort of business. And so there was a lot to be done. But when I went home that afternoon, and I'd already obviously rung my wife and told her, I guess my feelings on that day were split between being very angry in the sense that the job hadn't been done and I hadn't been given the opportunity to allow the recovery program that we'd put in place to really take effect, because we were still at the bottom of a pretty tough recession. And I knew that as Australia would come out of that recession, as it always has done, we would come out with it as well. And so from that point of view, I was fairly angry. But on the other hand, you know, I feel quite ashamed to say that I felt in some sense relieved, because suddenly I wasn't responsible. John Urig had taken over as executive chairman, and all those things that I was wholly responsible for to the board weren't mine. And in some way I thought, well, you know, and a whole sort of sway of problems just went out of my mind. And I feel quite ashamed to say that because I shouldn't have felt that way, but I did.
Well, I would say there's nothing to feel ashamed about at all. There is no better time to judge the character of a man than when he has been felled, and you came through with flying colours. So could I go on to the are we going all right? 5 more minutes?
Keep going.
After leaving the bank in 1992, you have gone on to a stellar career. You have chaired major Australian companies including St George Bank, Howard Smith, Oryx Australia, Elders Australia, and you've served on the boards of Santos and David's, Placer Pacific, and so many others. You've chaired 4 government boards and served on a multiple of others. It's been a remarkable professional career. I know we'd love to hear more about those things, but we have to jump ahead and just ask you, tell us a little bit about your not-for-profit work post your time after Westpac.
Well, you get drawn into fundraising type committees. So I was on, for example, the Heart Foundation at one stage. They were raising funds for the War Memorial at one stage. I was on that committee in Sydney. My old university in Perth, the University of Western Australia, they had a foundation and they wanted a Sydney committee, so I was on that. Along with Richard Goyder, who's now Managing Director of West Farmers, so it's a small world. But I think the one that I loved the most was I was asked, well, I first of all joined the board and then subsequently became its chairman, was the Australian Brandenburg Orchestra. And I was there in that role for about 10 years and still go to their concerts to this day. And it was a great, I mean, I can remember the times where we just didn't have any dollars in the bank at all. We'd had a couple of concerts at the Opera House that had failed because it wasn't their scene to have concerts there. And we didn't know what we were going to do. Unfortunately, the Premier of Premier of New South Wales, who was also the Minister for Arts, Bob Carr, had a bit of a soft spot for us, and he gave us a loan which I assured him would never be repaid. And we got through, and now it's just a very, very successful orchestra, which I'm just very proud of.
It certainly is. Frank, this is the last question, and I'm going to precede it with a little comment. Frank, right from the very first time that I met you, but particularly when I was in my non-executive roles, each time I would see you, very often at a St George Foundation board meeting, you would go into detail asking questions about my boards, and you would say, what's happening with the detailed IPART Commission on AGL's pricing and infrastructure? Or you would say, how's that spin-off in Rinka going for CSR? Or what's happening with the water in the Barossa Valley for SA Water? And I used to think to myself, this man is remarkable. He's across what I'm doing. He understands the issue on the board. And Frank, it has been an enormous privilege to know you over these years and to have that sort of feedback from someone. But what is it that particularly interests you today? And how do you feed that extraordinary thirst for knowledge and your very special ongoing civic and community mindedness?
Well, on the business side, I don't think I've lost the appetite to watch business programs and listen to business summaries. I sometimes laugh at some of the comments that I hear. Here we go again, you often hear yourself saying, particularly on the bank side. And one thing that I've learned over the last 20, 25 years is that nothing really changes. It's the same model that goes on and it just comes out in a different form. And I hear all the chief executives of the various companies say exactly the same things that I was forced to say back in talking to the media and the analysts and the rating agencies and so on back in my day. So the hunger for knowledge about business is still there, and I enjoy that. And of course it's so much easier now with internets and iPads and all that sort of stuff. The civic side, well, I seem to get conned into roles. I got conned into being on the board of this private school in the Southern Highlands, and how I ever been conned into that, I don't know. I then was asked to be its chairman, and of course you're locked in then because you need to do about 5 years, and it doesn't matter what sort of work you do. Being a chairman, you've got to be there, and and you've got to do the ceremonial part of it as well as attending board meetings and all that sort of thing. So, and then after promising myself I'd never ever be on another government board, because I think they treat their directors appallingly, I got absolutely conned into joining this local health district board down at Liverpool, and where we look after the hospitals at Bankstown and Fairfield and Liverpool and Campbelltown and Camden and Bowral, and it was the Bowral bit that sort of got me attracted a little. But I thought education was a great big box, but health is about as big as this room. It's very, very complex, almost as bad as BHP, I'd say. Very, very big indeed, very complex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very brief, but what a wonderful insight. Before I call on Media Past President Peter to say a vote of thanks, I think, Frank, you should have the last question. I think we didn't really hear much about Carolyn's volunteer work, etc., and I think a little bit about that, or something around that you might like just to ask her. I think that should be told to the...
Well, you did make some mention that you were on a lot of not-for-profit, and one in particular I recall, looking at your background, was in the citation for your Order of Australia, which you very commendably was awarded, and that is the YWCA.
The YWCA I was involved with for nearly 20 years, and when I moved to live in Adelaide, that particular not-for-profit came to a halt. But over the years, probably 13 or 14 or 15 not-for-profits. My particular interest at the moment is threefold. I chair the Westpac Foundation, which I love, and we are making a real difference to the disadvantaged and disabled through the Westpac Foundation, to refugees, to those who are unemployed. And I hope Susan might be able to come back sometime and tell you more about what we're actually doing there. The Neurosurgical Research Foundation, I joined over 20 years ago, and one never thinks when you join a not-for-profit organisation that you might need neurosurgery, but I had a little baby who needed neurosurgery, and that one's very close to my heart. And there are a number of others relating to breast cancer and workplace giving, but all of these are things that actually make me feel good about myself, and I love being able to contribute in that way.
And of course you and I met again at the St George Foundation. Yeah.
That's right.
How do you follow that? Can I just say this, that this was rather a novel idea to have a couple of our distinguished people up here in an interview format, and I personally wasn't too sure how it was going to go.
Neither was I.
But I have to tell you, it's been a fantastic success. Would you agree? We heard initially from Carolyn about the fact that, such a beautiful, bright, bouncy. How did you get into the dismal science of economics? That seemed to be quite hard to reconcile. But a great talk there to give us an insight into a very interesting and wonderful career. So thank you, Carolyn. It's very, very well done. And for Frank, who we all know and respect, and we've come to appreciate his continued presence here, along with Bob. It's great to see chief executives continuing to support the Rock in the way that they do. The Christmas function was fantastic, and this is again, Frank, is a credit to you to participate in this one. Frank and I have crossed paths on a number of occasions. I was reminded there in some of the discussion how while he was still chief executive, he whispered in my ear one day, "I'm sending you to Western Australia, Peter." And I nearly fell over backwards. I said, "Have you got the right bloke?" But then he put the fear of God into me by saying, "I come from Western Australia, and every person that you're likely to meet is probably one of my relatives." And I treated every person I knew in Western Australia as a relative of Frank, and it took 6 months before I found the first one. But it did work out. So Frank, you've done a wonderful job today. Carolyn, wonderful job. We've got something there that we're about to present. So President Steve is just offering a little vote of thanks for them. And thank you one and all for coming along today to join in.